Hello. Hello, everyone, and welcome to an online presentation from Biometric Update. We discuss the hot topics and important issues in biometrics and digital identity. I'm your host and the managing editor of Biometric Update, Chris Burt. Today, we're going to talk about the market for digital ID that is emerging in the Asia-Pacific region, with several countries announcing new regulations, whether directly from the government or from an authority, such as a central bank. At Biometric Update, we've been covering the launch of national ID systems, regulatory changes to allow people to sign up for bank accounts or make different kinds of transactions online, and it seems like more of them are on the way. We're going to delve into those and the changes happening in several countries, some of which, and some of the international standards and specifications for digital identity and biometrics that they make use of, and how technology providers can meet the needs of the different countries, the many businesses, and the millions of people in each of them. Before we get into the discussion, a few quick housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation. All of you lucky attendees will be receiving an emailed link so you can watch it over and over again at your leisure. Audience discussion will come a little bit later on. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function, which you should find near the bottom of your screen. Joining me today, I'm pleased to say, we have Paul Heim, representing the FIDO Alliance, one of the bodies that sets those specifications and standards. How are you today, Paul?
Doing well. How are yourself, Chris?
Very good, thank you. Great, and thanks for joining us. And we also have Ted Dunstone of BixeLab, an Australia-based testing lab that can help you with some of those certifications referred to. How are you doing today, Ted?
Good, very good. Thanks, Chris.
Perfect. So to give you a little bit of background on our guest today, Paul is the certification director for the FIDO Alliance, which is a huge international organization backed by many of the world's largest businesses that do anything involving identity. The group works to get rid of all the fraud that goes along with passwords, and as part of that effort, the Alliance has ended up setting up certification programs, which you will want to know about, and Paul is the person to ask. Ted is the CEO of BixeLab, which is one of the world's most well-known and respected biometrics and digital identity laboratories. He's also the CEO of Biometrics, which brings in the consultancy side of things, and also the founder of the Biometrics Institute. He is the person to ask about the testing that goes into certification. So we're going to talk all about those things today. Let's talk to Ted more about what's going on in the region in a minute. But first, I'd like to start with Paul. Can you please give us a quick review of the FIDO Alliance and its work on digital identity related standards and certifications?
I'd be happy to, Chris. Thank you. Just pulling up some slides here for everyone. As Chris has mentioned, the FIDO Alliance, what's our mission? Our core mission, as an open industry association, we have a focus to reduce the world's reliance on passwords. To accomplish this, the FIDO Alliance promotes the development, use, and compliance with standards, requirements for authentication, identity verification, and device attestation. FIDO first started within authentication, developing those requirements, growing a membership to now 400 plus, including a number of liaison organizations that are affiliated with FIDO's work. We bring together a consensus-driven body to establish requirements, to establish protocol specs, and to also establish certification programs. The three main work areas to fulfill our mission include those technical specifications and/or technical requirements, all the way going down to even like a white paper or best practices. In addition to that, we have our industry certification programs, which I'll touch on in a minute. And then in addition, we're here to utilize and enable these technical protocol specs and requirements through market adoption and enablement. We work within a very active membership to accomplish these goals, to reduce that reliance on passwords, And specifically then around our certification programs, we have a number of them. Our certification programs are product certification programs. So we are looking at a component. I would say always we are certifying the fuel tank to the car, not the whole car itself. As we define then our certification programs, we have a couple of categories here. We have user authentication, where we complete functional certification, including conformance testing, interoperability testing on authenticators and servers. We have various then levels of security assurance related to the authenticator level of certification. Within identity verification, which we're going to go into more detail today specifically around, we have two components that we're looking at. Now, IDV solutions may include many other fraud signals and/or capabilities, but FIDO has begun their work within IDV to address specifically face verification and document authenticity for remote mobile solutions. That is your, take a picture of the government issued ID, complete onboarding, complete it with selfie match liveness through the IDV flow onto then, in a lot of cases, authentication. We also have a program around biometric components for the assessment of various biometric modalities from fingerprint to face itself when we're considering different types of enrollment. And lastly, device authentication or device onboarding. The work areas of IDV, identity, as well as device attestation were two of the newer work areas that FIDO has adopted. That are very complementary to what is in cultivation and what has grown to be quite large with passkeys within user authentication. Touching on and going into a bit more detail, for why FIDO looked at ID verification. Authentication has been proven to, FIDO authentication specifically has been proven to protect against account takeover, is phishing resistant, and addresses trial-based attacks. But what happens, for example, when you lose an authenticator or when you're doing brand new account onboarding? FIDO wanted to look at and define requirements and performance for the quality of these solutions. To be able to set a threshold, to be able to drive the market to developing better technology. That is where FIDO's then entered into the IDV space. It's very complementary to the authentication work that takes and protocol messaging that takes place later on within a number of different ceremonies or flows for identity verification and authentication. And so I'll turn it back on over to Chris. Thank you for letting me have this introduction on FIDO, and I'm looking forward to going into greater detail specifically around the IDV program.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. So you've got an idea now about what the FIDO Alliance does and how it plays into the requirements that are built into all these schemes. Now, Ted, can you give us a little bit of background about what BixeLab does and just about this market in general? You're on mute there, Ted.
Apologies. Okay. Great. Let me just pull up a slide pack. So yes, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Paul, as well, for the really good introduction to FIDO. FIDO is an organization that we have worked closely with, and you see as we move through how important they're going to be, I think, to the digital ID market into the future. As continuing Paul's analogy of the car, any complex system that we have in our modern life, especially one that has the potential to cause harm or to have bad consequences if it doesn't work properly, we rely on standards and we rely on testing of those standards, often independent testing. So for cars, for instance, there's not only the certification of the components, but there's also the crash testing of the whole car. And so at BixeLab, we really believe that the independent testing by the right people to be able to do that testing with the right sets of experience is actually a really important part of ensuring that the ID market is able to deliver what its promise is to everybody, which is being able to supply trust and security. So BixeLab, who we are a testing and
Excuse me, Ted. Just want
oh
to
yes,
interrupt you
sorry.
for a moment. I cannot see your slides.
Okay, no problems. Let me see if I can fix that. How's that?
There we go.
Is that my slides showing?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Excellent. So yes, so BixeLab, we are a testing and compliance laboratory, and we do certification for anything to do with identity, biometrics, and increasingly also AI related technologies as well. We're Asia Pacific's only NIST and FIDO endorsed lab, which means that we can offer internationally recognized certification of either components or all systems. And we're involved with a range of different types of certification. I will go into those in a little bit more detail in a moment. But just at the very high level, liveness and presentation attack detection, obviously front of mind for a lot of people in relation to deep fakes and a variety of other ways that people can present themselves fraudulently to these systems. Matching accuracy, it's not enough to know that you have a live person in front of you, but you want to know that it really is the correct person that you're verifying, and that's the accuracy component. In many cases, people are presenting documentary evidence when they are onboarding, particularly for banks and other types of places that require that sort of strong link to documents. And so that's an area called document authenticity, which also has a range of different standards and tests. Indeed, FIDO has been one of the organizations which has really been leading that particular area. Then there's the area of bias evaluation. And so bias evaluation in biometrics relates to does it really work for all of the people that you need it to work for? Whether that can, of course, be in different ethnicities. We know in the past many algorithms have struggled with particular types of ethnicities, but it doesn't just need to be ethnicity. It can be age. It can even be device. So we have many examples where newer devices have much better sensors on them, which means that the accuracy of an algorithm can be significantly better. And finally, there's a lot of action happening around the world to do with age assurance. And so this is in an Australian context looked at from social media, but of course it applies to a whole lot of things, whether it's driving a car or buying alcohol or any other sort of activity that we don't want minors to have free rein in. And so there's certainly an element of making sure that we can trust if we are using age assurance technology, whether that's biometrics or other forms of age assurance technology, that is accurate. And so the sorts of clients that BixeLab deals with come from a whole range of different sectors. They're governments or NGOs, financial services, biometric suppliers, obviously, airlines, and a number of other different sectors as well. If we're looking at evaluating biometric effectiveness, we have talked formally about the quality, sort of accuracy and pad, but of course there are a whole range of different things that go into making it a biometric system effective, and all of those things can be assessed in one way or another. And so I won't go through all of those, but probably call out the first one, which is quality. So where you are taking a biometric, if you're not able to assess and check that you're getting the right quality, well, that has all sorts of impacts on system performance. And I'll return to that later. And also the final one, security here, if you may have heard of injection attacks, and injection attacks, of course, are part of the wider spectrum of things that can happen to systems if they're not properly designed. I won't dwell on this slide other than to say there are lots of different standards and compliance regimes for each of the things that I've just mentioned. There's a number of things that are emerging as well. So, for instance, I'll just call out the bias evaluation, which is 19795, and the template protection evaluation, which is 30136. The other one I haven't mentioned so far is the bottom one there, which is the MOSIP supplied testing. And so MOSIP is a framework which is used by a number of governments around the world, most notably in the Asia Pacific. It's not used by the Philippines. And we are a lab that can test for quality, biometric quality associated. In fact, we helped set up the scheme for MOSIP on the quality for checking for those enrollment devices. So if we look across the Asia Pacific, there's a whole range of differing regimes, differing components from different countries. And I won't go through these in detail. Indeed, many of the frameworks themselves are still relatively young, but we are seeing an increasing number of particularly vendors coming to us who would like to be able to make sure that their devices are going to meet the requirements of various regulators across the sectors. And so as part of that, we've been involved with a number of evaluations for the Malaysian system. And the Malaysian system they have a circular from the bank BNM that basically specifies in reasonable detail what is required of people that would like to be able to meet those standards. Across some of the other countries, I know that FIDO is referenced as being part of the various standards that make up the requirements. And one of the things which I'm keen to do, I think, is make sure that we provide the information on the BixeLab website so that we can actually say what it is that suppliers need to be able to do in order to meet the requirements of the various governments. And in particular, ultimately, we would hope that there'll be a degree of harmonization. Because, of course, if you are selling a device from one place, you don't want to have to jump through arbitrary other hoops in another place unless they are very specifically required for a local reason. So I think at the moment we are still in a phase where these requirements are coming out, and there's going to be a lot more information that will become available. I'd encourage anybody who's on the call who might be from one of these regulatory agencies, if you would like to share some more information about what is happening in country, we'd be delighted to jump on a call, or indeed anybody else that might have that information, because I think what is needed is somewhere where we can collate that information and make sure that everybody is aware of what standards and things are happening. If we look at the regional frameworks very quickly, we have some common elements, so they all relate to biometric verification in one way. They all have some degree of testing requirements. Some of those testing requirements are more detailed or less detailed. And one of the things which is relatively common is that they mostly relate to the eKYC or AML requirements or CTF requirements, which is a really great place to start. But obviously, it doesn't end there in terms of where these requirements could end up So there's on the divergent side, there's obviously some scope variation in what is covered by the regulations. There are different ways that people need to report risks or outcomes, and some frameworks deal with document authenticity and some don't. And finally, to Paul's point about regulating the part of the car, one of the things that we think is really good about the Malaysian regulation is they talk about what they call breakthrough testing, which is where you've got the components, but you need to put them all together and see how the system works end to end. And that is such an important part of making sure you've got a secure system. And then my final slide just talks quickly about what you can do to ensure this regulatory compliance. And of course, the first thing is stay informed. So you'll already tick that box because you're on this webinar. But basically understand what sorts of regulations are coming out within the region, what sorts of testing is going to be required. And for the most part, when you are doing this testing, if you are mindful of what those regulations are, you won't need to do multiple different tests for different countries. You can make sure that you do all the testing that's going to be required in one area. And then another thing that we often recommend, particularly for suppliers that are already operating in markets, is what we call health checks, which is not like a full assessment, but it kind of gives you a temperature check as to whether you're operating in the right area or not. So with that, I might pass back to Chris for some discussion.
Great, thank you, Ted. So now we've got a better idea of what those regulatory schemes are that we're talking about. And again, so what we're dealing with at this point is largely developments in the eKYC space. But as Ted mentioned, there is a lot of potential for expansion going forward, and as has already come up a couple of times, these things are all sort of still in development. So I guess where I'd like to start is just by asking Ted, what country are you seeing or hearing the most demand for certification to at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So at the moment, we're seeing a lot of interest in Malaysia. I think because the standards there are sort of more developed, perhaps, than they are in some other markets. So that's been a little bit of a surprise to us this year, but it's been really great to see. But other markets, including Thailand and Vietnam, and to a lesser extent, the Philippines, we're seeing inquiries and organizations that are starting to think about what they're going to be needing to do in order to be compliant.
Just seeing some change in that already as we go along.
Yeah, and we know that regardless of where these regulations are at the moment, there are a lot of people working in this particular space, and within government. So I'm sure that we will see a lot of new laws and regulations coming out over the next 1 to 2 years.
Great. And Paul, I'd like to ask you basically a modified version of the same question. What's your experience been in terms of, now, I mean, I know that you're on the certification side, but can you speak at all to sort of engagement with regulatory authorities or not, outside of regulators, players in the digital identity space who might be FIDO members? What kind of engagement are you seeing at this point?
We have a lot of cultivation and activity. It's especially within this specific region of the world. A lot of this is coming from the historical context and success that FIDO authentication has had, how to establish those standards, how to establish very strong certification programs. And through adoption and through then looking at this new work area that's also new even within a FIDO respectively over the last 3 years. When we think about then how do you enable it, how do you grow that adoption elsewhere? utilizing the model that we've done for authentication for here has been quite successful. Our engagements with a lot of the organizations like central banks and or financial institutions within this specific region of the world has been a cultivating factor for developing, for educating, for also just pulling in, use cases. There may be something that is very unique in this portion of the world versus something that we experience within Europe. We do like to try to draw comparisons. That's part of consensus building. It's part of the association and our goals for how we conduct business. But we do definitely, we see that, and then we see the results, FIDO certification being referenced, within a specific set of policy or a set of requirements. And we do want to grow that. And we want to also help influence where are the areas to help support. We also know that our identity verification certification program as it is today is not where it will be in the future. We will build on this, we'll evolve. Certification is meant to have an ongoing certification maintenance evolution aspect to it. And so we would hope that also we could, address any sort of new use cases and or needs of this specific region or elsewhere within our requirements and spec establishment.
But the take up has been in prior programs has been such that you're just essentially continuing the same path that's yielded so much success so far in the region. Yes,
very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, for any of you who have been attendees of FIDO Authenticate, for instance, you've heard a lot of success stories from the region that had certainly was reminded by your remarks, Paul, of a couple of those presentations from this past year. I'd actually like to skip ahead a couple of questions that I have here, because I'd like to invite attendees today. Anyone on the call, if you've got a question for Paul, if you've got a question for Ted, if you've got a question for either one of them or both, please feel free to add that in the chat, and we're going to get to those really soon. So I'd just like to speed ahead to that portion if we can. But I want to talk a little bit more about the standards and specifications behind these. The FIDO Alliance builds its own certifications and specifications, but those are interconnected with others, right? So, maybe I'll turn to you on that first, Paul. In addition to the FIDO Alliance's own standards and certifications, what would you call out that maybe people should keep in mind in this region?
Yeah, I would call out that FIDO not only takes the approach of establishing a requirement or a protocol spec within its own consensus and within its own documentation and realm, but is also contributing actively to ISO requirements. So just most recently, ISO 30107, for example, for presentation attack testing, those requirements over time have now etched out its own annex, that is the FIDO annex within ISO 30107 that is now published. We're doing the same with contributions to 19795, part 2. So our working groups are very active, and our community is very active in taking a pronged approach to making sure that we're also contributing to those global standards. So when you look at a certification, you're adding to the comprehensive nature with that certification, that what you're getting out of value out of it, because you're, in fact, also meeting these respective testing requirements that are international standards. And so it's the FIDO body and the FIDO contribution that can do that. And we continue to plan to do so. Our authentication requirements, for example, like contributing to ITU, we do look at trying to contribute to a broader grouping of requirements and protocol specs than just the FIDO ones themselves.
Absolutely, yeah, and a couple of important ISO standards there to keep in mind. Ted, can you add any other schemes or requirements?
Yeah, certainly. Look, I think I think what FIDO does obviously is excellent in terms of that backwards and forwards between the real experts that are in FIDO and the ISO standards. But there are a whole range of other standards as well that sit currently outside of FIDO, and also the FIDO use case isn't necessarily for everybody. So I think it is important to understand that FIDO is a really important player in this standards ecosystem, but it's not the only way to achieve certification. And indeed, in some cases, it does make sense to look just at the ISO standards and at getting accredited based on them. And I think we will see, though, over time, I think this is kind of what Paul was alluding to, that there will be a degree of increased harmonization. At the moment, the standards are, slightly different stages of development, slightly different components. And so there is a little, I won't say confusion, but when you see the graph of the different things that you can get certified to, it's easy to think that it's a lot, but actually there are a whole lot of common elements there. And I think what we will end up seeing over time is an evolution towards a more harmonized version of that. But I want to just emphasize again that FIDO is not the only way to get certified. Sorry, Paul.
No, that's not. Hey, there are differences. So there's certainly, I would fully agree, there are those differences. Thinking about different levels of comprehensive, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to validate?
Yeah, correct. Thanks, Chris. Back to you.
Yeah, and yeah, that's all very good points. And I when we actually in preparation for this call, we talked a little bit about verifiable credentials, which are emerging as a standard that is in some cases, again, is not. There are some situations this is not going to be relevant for you. But there are others where you will want to be well aware of that standard and make sure that you're actually compliant with it. Another one that just jumps immediately to mind for me, the ICAO standard for essentially for face biometric, for image quality for a facial image, so that you can perform a biometric match on it. Something that comes up for us at Biometric Update all the time. Yeah, so let's move from there to sort of the use case side. These specifications set by FIDO and other bodies can be applied across the financial sector, but also in other areas as well, right? So how do you see those specifications applying, or how the frameworks will move forward into other areas of application? Yeah, Paul, do you want to go first on that one too?
Yeah, I think again, going to also to back to Ted's point about what are you trying to achieve out of a certification? Just not a FIDO certification, but any other use case or I would say end goal. What is that result? With different use cases, different certifications apply. And so thinking about what are your business drivers from a relying party perspective, why are you trying to achieve something? In a FIDO case, there could be something very specific around document authenticity, or something that's very specific around face verification that is applying to different industry sectors. We're seeing our adoption in our side. We're seeing a great adoption around financial institutions, higher risk models, for account onboarding, for any sort of digital ID, identity verification that's going to lead to something like creation of a passkey for the purpose of authentication. That's where we see a close tie. Now, something like age assurance, FIDO doesn't do age assurance. It's not part of our scope of identity. It's been talked about briefly within our working groups. it's certainly an area of, right along with certain other elements of KYC, that our identity framing doesn't address for use cases. But very much so, there are a number of other certifications that could apply that are industry certifications related to those. I don't know if you want to just call them components, because it's not necessarily a component. It's, it's a part of a greater complex solution that needs to be assessed. And at the end of the day, we want to drive these technologies to be better. That is one of the purpose. That's one of the outcomes with FIDO that we really want to try to achieve, is to help contribute to that ongoing evolution.
Absolutely. And I mean, Paul, as you raise the prospect of account onboarding, it seems to me that that's you've got kind of a half step from there to government services, right? Or from onboarding and financial services to government services, right? And then so we've talked about age as well. Ted, anything to add on the application side?
Yeah, I mean, I think we will see this interplay between what's called foundational and functional identity.
Good point.
And so what we're talking about here in many cases with financial services is more on the functional identity. It's an identity which is used to accomplish something. Obviously, in a KYC type fashion that has linkages through to a foundational identity. But it's interesting that across the region, there are all sorts of projects in place that will be upgrading and changing the foundational identity systems. And there is a direct connection, of course, between those foundational identity systems and the standards and the connection points that are applied to those systems as well. And so one of the key things which I would like to leave the people on the call thinking about is, if you buy a laptop and it's got some standards associated with it, those standards are applicable no matter where. I mean, those standards hold up no matter where you take your laptop. That's not exactly true for biometric systems because of the different usage patterns, because of the different devices that people might use the technology with, and of course, because of different demographic considerations. So it is the case that when you see a testing report, you really do need to understand what that testing report is telling you. And if that testing report is relevant for your particular use case and demographic. And if it's not, you don't necessarily need to do a full test. Again, like a full test can be difficult and expensive. I get that. But it is possible to do smaller scale tests that help revalidate that results that you got in one region are still relevant to the area that you're working in.
Fantastic. All good points. And we do have some questions from our attendees at this point, so I'd like to turn to those. Thank you again to those of you who have posed some questions. We've got one here from AJR who asks, how are regulatory bodies addressing the challenges posed by generative AI-driven fraud, such as deepfakes, and what role does the FIDO Alliance see itself playing in shaping standards to mitigate these risks? So we've kind of touched on this, but yeah, Paul, can you take us a little further on that one?
Yeah, so the FIDO requirements and the FIDO standard not only start to look at deepfakes, they're looking at equity and bias. They're also looking at even a starting point for addressing injection attacks, looking at the security of this whole solution. With that, we wanted to introduce a set of requirements that were that met a balance between what a relying party might be requiring and the necessary need, as well as also considering the vendor itself and the cost and the burden to evaluation and certification. And so what we've introduced for a version 1.1 of our requirements, we have a couple of different versions between our doc auth and our face certification. There's some nuance there, but what we have introduced is this starting point, and we do want to build off of this. And so we do want to evolve our test cases We do want to evolve how we're completing our performance evaluation, what we're doing for and requiring around our test procedures for pad testing. Those are all aspects here that are at a starting point and will progress. And with the certification program, we want to maintain that within its life cycle. And so if we go back to also one of Ted's comments about what can we do to consider items like that would reduce the burden of evaluation by doing maybe a smaller test. Those are all parts of what we call certification maintenance in our program and within the policy and framework that we've established to a degree. We want to look at what are maybe other companion programs that we can pull in, taking results that have already been evaluated, you reutilizing that biometric data for the purpose of FIDO certification. So we have a long ways to go with the further development of our program, but we're at we have come from a consensus-driven organization. We've tried to establish something that is a starting point.
Fantastic. Yeah, and the work goes on, right? Ted, deepfakes, generative AI-driven fraud?
Yeah, so we do a lot of that testing. So our customers, of course, are very concerned about that. And anybody that's been following this space knows just how fast things have moved. For those of you that haven't had a look at Sora, for instance, it's the new OpenAI video model. These threats that used to be things that were maybe required quite sophisticated back-end processing are rapidly getting to the point where it is relatively low barrier to entry, which means that as an industry, we have to do better. We have to make sure that we are checking and managing these types of fakes, managing the detection of these types of fakes. That is, of course, part of presentation attack detection. And there's a lot to kind of unpack there, but it doesn't matter what biometric you're using, what face, voice, or fingerprint, like they are all affected by this generative AI. And one of the things that I think hasn't yet, so this is slightly broadening the conversation, but you can see me on this video call and have some degree of trust that it is me. But I don't think that that will be the case in 12 months' time. The technologies that we've seen that we test in our labs now, they're not quite there, but they're just not that far away from being able to impersonate me on a call. And what does that practically mean? Because we do a lot of our lives, right, online. How are we going to trust the people that we interact with digitally online? And I think the FIDO work and other work in this identity sector is actually going to suddenly become a lot more relevant to other areas than we currently think about than just sort of the financial transactions.
Absolutely. So a very pertinent question. And yeah, and if I can kind of boil that all down, regulatory bodies are thinking about PAD, presentation attack detection. They're thinking about injection attack detection, both of which we've now touched on today. And that's really how they can sort of most directly address those pressing and increasingly pressing concerns. We've got another question here. Maybe we could take care of this quickly. From an anonymous attendee, what is the largest use case within national ID programs? Is it banking? Now, this is a tricky question by nature because we're really generalizing over, kind of over a region here. But is it fair to say, maybe as a general in a general sense, that banking is the big use case?
Oh, can I take that to start?
Yeah, no, please do. Yeah, no, I would defer to you actually with you being in the region on this one.
Look, it's a difficult question to answer generically, but my answer is that really big use case is foundational ID, right? So, for instance, in the Philippines, they have issued over 100 million digital IDs as part, which include biometrics. So, those sort of numbers then leak not leak, that lead, I should say, directly to financial or other sorts of transactions. But if you're purely going by the number of people that are directly using and affecting it, it will be foundational ID, which will definitely generate the most. If you are talking specifically about the Asia Pacific as a whole at the moment, I think it would be hard to know because in terms of actual use case, like in other words, people using biometrics to achieve things, I suspect that it is that more functional use, the more use for banking transactions and things that actually you would find is in more frequently used than the foundational.
Yeah, one thing that I would just add there is I think it's instructive, maybe the widest disparity, let's say, between the foundational ID system or the national ID program and the banking sector, we would see in India, right? Aadhaar is the largest digital ID system in the world by a very wide margin, and most of the people who have their Aadhaar cannot, for instance, use it to open a bank account. Even they would struggle probably within India, and certainly opening one in another country is simply not going to be an option for the overwhelming majority of those people. So banking seems to me is certainly one of the biggest ones, but I would agree with your point, Ted, that you have to have the foundational ID to get to the banking system, right? We've got a question here from Asfar Adib. Nice to hear from you, Asfar, a fellow Canadian. APAC region is experiencing new regulations in different streams, like Australia's restrictions on social media for kids under 16. How do these accelerate the biometric market? Who'd like to take this one?
I'll start. So I think the issue to do with age verification is a very it's a very interesting issue about how you use technology to drive that. And it's more than we have time for now. I'm sure there's probably another biometric update on age verification. But I think this issue more generally around identity and about binding identity is it permeates lots of different areas. And so as a consequence, we will see that drive the market. And we will see, age estimation and age verification is very much a regulatory function, right? You don't do it really unless you are being told that you have to do it. And so as a consequence, I think there will be more regulation, which plays into that particular type of space.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to throw anything on there as well, Paul?
I would just comment too, going back to one of my prior comments of, it fell out of scope for FIDO. When we were working as a working group, just to put context around it, we really had to define what were those use cases, what was closely connected to binding with authentication and thinking about the authentication ceremony and flow. And so our starting point here, and going also back to that comment, our starting point is without it being within the scope of our certification programs, but we are looking at, for example, we just most recently added in NFC as like a capability within consideration of documents and how that plays into optical and electronic transfer for like face verification. That's a great example of adding capabilities and or adding features to these more complex systems for evaluation for the purpose of certification. At this point in time, though, age just wasn't within that scope for something that we found that we needed to address right off the bat. We found a greater need with our members and with reliant parties to start with with the document and with the face verification.
Yeah, so you've always got to have that foundation, right? And it sounds like this is another area where things are moving fast. So yeah, let's try and go do a speed round here and get through these last few questions before we run out of time. We've got one specifically on FIDO lingo here. So it says FIDO 2 specifications used to be known as passkeys. I'm not sure that's exactly the correct way to put that. So I'm going to throw this over to you.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to quickly address this. So what's being referenced here within this question for FIDO2 and FIDO UAF or FIDO U2F, these are all our authenticator protocol specifications. All of these specifications, though, are passkeys. So when you create a credential, when you are going through the authentication ceremony, you're establishing, creating that passkey. That passkey could be created based on any of these protocol specs. They have different representations for each. I would really classify them FIDO2, FIDO UAF. There are some nuances between both, but for terminology's sake, we're looking at a passkey as a credential and for authentication ceremony, not really related to IDV, except for there is a binding aspect to this, where with like something like account onboarding or account recovery with identity verification that we're trying to accomplish between both, because there is usually a biometric on a mobile device that is then establishing a passkey when you're being prompted by the platform like iOS or Android or Microsoft, Windows to set up your passkey. So it plays a critical role, complementary in nature.
Perfect. And moving right along, just to try and get in as many as we can here, we've got a question from Satya Suri, who says, great presentations from Paul and Ted. His question is for both of you. Issues around certification standards and testing are well noted and pertinent. But what more needs to be done or gaps still exist with regards to acceptance networks and trust frameworks necessary for increasing adoption both on issuers of digital ID credentials as well as verifiers? Ted, why don't you start us off here?
Yeah, I think we've already kind of alluded to this in a way, in terms of the fact that there's a distance to travel. I would agree with the questioner in the sense that I think we are in an intermediate stage at the moment, with verifiable credentials coming down the line, with all the changes which are happening related to passkeys and those sort of areas as well. I think this sector will look very different in about 5 years' time. But one of the key things that I'd like to emphasize is I think it's really important when regulators are making rules that they seek for local organizations, that they seek out people that can help them with that, particularly because it's quite complex. It is a complex landscape, and it's not something that regulators can kick down the line and say, well, we'll deal with in 3 years' time. Something that has to be dealt with now. And there is a smooth path forward, but please seek out the right expertise.
Yeah, be it expertise by a lab, accredited lab like what BixeLab is, or even looking at then the association aspects, as well as then other there are many other associations, governing bodies that all have channels for understanding what is happening in this space and where these different organizations are looking.
Fantastic. Let's try and squeeze one more in here before we wrap up. You know what? There's a question here from asked a little while ago about 3D mask testing under PAD. Is there any criteria or mandate for 3D mask testing? How could they be taken into consideration? And also a question here about the approximate costs of masks. So Ted, I know you have the answer to all of this question, so please take it away.
Yeah, so the landscape for different attacks is always changing, and one of the consequences of that is that the standards are not super prescriptive. FIDO is a little bit more prescriptive than ISO, but they allow for this idea that you are going to be getting different attack types over time, and also that different attack types are more or less relevant depending on a use case. So when we talked about 3D masks, that is absolutely something that we do in our lab. And indeed, if you're interested, you can go to our website and you'll see there's a little video down the bottom that shows some of the things that are happening in our lab. So if you go to an accredited lab, one of the things that you get from accredited labs is the fact that they check to make sure you know what you're doing, that they're up to date with the latest threats, that they've got the right people to be able to make and procure artifacts, etc. So that's really one of the key things that you are purchasing when you come to a lab. In terms of the actual costs of these, a good 3D mask will still set you back in the vicinity of $1,000 US. But I do want to emphasize for those of you that are on the call, depending on the type of nature of the the system you're using, 3D masks are a lot less effective in many instances than many other mechanisms. So, you know, deep fake mechanisms, even potentially paper cutouts that are printed. So just because an attack is more sophisticated doesn't correlate to it being more successful as an attack type. I'm not saying we don't need to test with these masks. Of course we do, but I'm just saying just because you've tested with something more sophisticated doesn't mean you need to forget about testing the less sophisticated artifacts as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I always find it surprising, you know, even repeated examples, what passes automated remote test evaluations or matching exercises and what doesn't. So that's fantastic. We're just not going to have quite enough time to get to those last couple remaining questions. But I'd like to throw it back to Ted for just a couple of final remarks, if you could, please.
Yes, sure. Let me just... Is my screen showing?
We can see it. Perfect.
Great. Excellent. So my final slide is basically just to say reach out for people if they'd like to stay in touch with us, or if you've got specific things you'd like to talk to us about, please be in touch. We have a newsletter called ID Risk Alerts. The link is on there. And if you'd like to get subscribed, please go to the link or send us an email. Obviously, we'd be super happy to have a chat, even if it's a speculative chat about things that you might think about be doing in the future. We have a site called Bixie Academy, which is basically training and assurance around upskilling for these issues to do with the different types of testing requirements. Sometimes that means you can do local testing, for instance. And finally, we talked a little bit about quality before. And one of the things that the lab has been doing in association with biometrics is putting out an open source tool. It's called BCAT, and it's available for download today. And basically, it lets you do quality assessment of biometrics of any biometric source. So thanks, Chris, and thanks, Paul. It's been really good discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ted. That is great information to have. So everyone, please do reach out to Ted, reach out to BixeLab. And Paul, final remarks and how can we get in touch with you?
Yeah, just going to shoot up a slide here too as well. For sort of the purpose of closing remarks from my perspective, kind of, two call to actions. We find great adoption and enablement occurring from when regulators and policymakers and or even reliant parties, example like a financial institution or a bank, when they're directly referencing a set of requirements for the purpose of requiring a FIDO certified product. And so for anyone on the call here, I would present that call to action and work with FIDO and or work internally in order to accomplish that, either in your policies and or, for example, like a reliant party, like in an RFP. Just a quick couple of contacts and information here. And then lastly, just to highlight our next event in this area for FIDO Alliance is a seminar taking place in Melbourne, Australia, on February 7th. It's actually sponsored in collaboration with BixeLab as well. We don't have our registration page live yet. It will be coming live in the next week. But if you want to, in the interim, contact marketing at FIDO Alliance, please feel free to do so. We'd love to have you at the event. This is a public-facing event, so all are welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you, Paul. So that's February 7th. Save the date. So yeah, please do reach out to Paul, get in touch with the FIDO Alliance, get involved, reach out to Ted and talk to your team about your testing and evaluation needs. We hope that you have all enjoyed this webinar and found it interesting and helpful. Thanks to all of you who watched and listened along, and thanks to those who submitted questions. Extra special thanks to Ted and to Paul for joining us today and sharing their insights. We'll be back soon to talk about all the many opportunities and challenges that go along with biometrics and digital ID. So until then, stay safe and have fun.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.